Let's cut to the chase about US action in Venezuela. One of two things is true. Either the extended pressure campaign is not actually about oil, or the Trump administration is doing a bad job at making headway on the issue. Now, I know exactly where the general public would go with that statement. Obviously, this war is about oil, and thus, obviously, the Trump administration has not provided a coherent plan for Venezuela. Heck, just the other day I had a thumbnail that says, "The plan is no plan," but that's the plan. And while that may ultimately prove true, give me a few minutes to explain the deeper puzzle here, or alternatively explain why the current strategy is not headed in a useful direction for anyone involved. And the great part here is that we get to head back to some classic lines on maps, and even better, the bargaining problem that oil brings to the table is nothing like we have seen before in Ukraine. Oh, just a reminder, I am here to explain the geopolitical policies that states choose. I am not here to pass moral judgment if they are philosophically right, so don't at me about any of this. Anyway, you know the basics, at least as we consider the problem over territory. First, we need to estimate what the expected outcome of war is. Then we need to realize that war is costly, because all of the people who will die and all of the money that will be wasted on the enterprise. Convert those costs for Venezuela into square kilometers of land, and represent that with the space between the yellow and white lines. Finally, convert the US costs to square miles of land, and represent that with the space between the white and red lines. And that is all we need to conclude that the sides ought to settle at something in between the red and yellow lines, as fighting would produce a worse outcome for both than dividing in any manner within that bargaining range. They are all close to the war outcome, but no one has to suffer the costs. Okay, one way people conceptualize oil wars is in the basic sense of literally fighting over oil. I see that you have oil in your country, and so I fight you to take it. Think about Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait as a classic example. To riff on the visual, though, think of the territory as a quantity of oil, and we get the same expectation. Such an incentive does not explain war by itself. Fighting over oil is not as profitable as negotiating over it. And indeed, there are a ton of real-life agreements that define how to divide resource wealth, precisely because fighting wars is costly. They just tend not to make the news, because peace is boring and war is, unfortunately, interesting. Rather, the key for today is investment, and specifically investment in oil infrastructure. Indeed, if you follow the political discourse in Washington, the central concern about Venezuela is not the oil directly. It is about building the infrastructure necessary to pull the oil out of the ground. And that is what causes a bargaining problem. First though, since this is a video ultimately about investments, it is fitting to welcome in today's sponsor, Outskill. Look, AI's role in our lives in 2026 is only going to accelerate, kind of like the news cycle right now. Well, Outskill is the first ever AI-focused educational platform designed to accelerate AI learning for people like you and me. And they are hosting their 2-day AI Mastermind training live this Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern on both days. Moreover, right now is the perfect time to sign up, because you can get in absolutely free as a part of their New Year Upskilling Fest. The 16-hour training program has already built more than 10 million AI-first professionals worldwide, and is rated 4.9 out of 5 on Trustpilot. You will learn how to build AI agents that plan, write, execute, and report for you, as well as connect tools like Sheets, Notion, CRMs, and email to create profitable systems. And when you sign up, you will also get access to the 2026 AI Survival Hackbook, a comprehensive compilation of the upcoming AI shifts this year, plus $5,000 in bonus tools. Seats are limited, so go to link.outskill.com/WilliamJAN3 or scan the QR code on your screen to grab your seat today, or join their WhatsApp group to stay updated before the big blast. And thanks again to Outskill for sponsoring today's video. Back to our own investment problem. One thing that we have consistently assumed when using the line logic to analyze Ukraine is that the size of what is at stake remains static. However, when we are talking about oil in developing countries, this is not true. The size of what can be divided between the two depends on investment decisions made today that can only pay out later. If no one does anything, the pie to be divided is small. If there is a lot of investment, then the pie can get huge. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves after all, even if the oil itself is not of great quality. However, there are a couple of issues here that combine together to create a much larger problem. 1. Investors from outside of the country will have to disproportionately bear the cost of investment. In all likelihood, much of the investment will come from the United States, but Europe is likely to take part in it as well. Either way, Venezuela lacks both the capital and expertise to tackle the problem on its own, after neglecting the industry for decades. Some of that was foreign-imposed neglect, of course, but the general point still stands. Over the long run, this may even necessitate building additional refineries inside of the United States to handle all of the oil. Now, if this were a standard business transaction in a domestic setting, the investment would be a no-brainer. Yes, the capital outlay would be absurd, but the profits would be even more absurd. So sign a contract and get rich. Wait, did you catch what I just said? Sign a contract? What have we learned about contracts in international relations? That is right, they are not externally enforceable. If a state says today that they will do something tomorrow, they have no true obligation tomorrow to follow through if it is no longer in their interest. In a domestic setting, you just take the issue to court, read the contract, and instantly win. In an international setting, court systems are weak, and no police force will recover your lost funds on your behalf. This is no hypothetical scenario either. Venezuela has a history of nationalizing its oil industry after companies invested to get the program running. It may be in the news today, but Venezuelan expropriation has frustrated administration after 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 administration. Yep, this goes back to the 1970s. And that is where the investment problem gets tricky. Investors know that they will get expropriated to some degree after they make the investment. It is inevitable in a world where the foreign government has military capacity. But they might be okay with it, as long as the government cannot extract too much. Just write up the profit-sharing agreement in a manner commensurate with that extractive pressure. However, if investors will be expropriated a great deal, then they do not make the investment in the first place. It will not ultimately return a profit. Economists call this a hold-up problem because the prospect of expropriation holds up an otherwise profitable investment. But this is not the end of the strategic considerations. Remember, war is inefficient because it destroys resources. Now, though, a productive investment is not being made in peace. It is possible that the inefficiency caused by the lack of investment is more inefficient than the cost of war. If so, no mutually acceptable settlement exists, and you end up getting war. Once upon a time, I enjoyed teaching this in the context of the American Revolution, and the colonists' desire to free themselves from the Crown's economic distortion. And a couple of years ago, I briefly had the opportunity to discuss this in the context of Guyana worrying that Venezuela would try to capture oil revenues once the former built out its oil infrastructure. However, today, insofar as the Trump administration discusses Venezuela in terms of oil, the mechanism that I just described is what underlies the crisis. Note that this type of oil war is not about using US military capacity to literally steal oil out of another country's ground, as again was the case with Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. In fact, this problem can arise even when no one contests the ownership of the oil itself. Rather, the problem is purely in the investment to pull the stuff out of the ground, who has to front the cash for that, and who can militarily capture the profits thereafter. Now, there are a couple of ways to solve this problem from the perspective of the investor. Option 1 is to accrue so much coercive power that you are no longer concerned about expropriation. Remember, like anything else in crisis bargaining, The effective tax is commensurate with the balance of power. If the opponent cannot win a war, then it also cannot force the investor to part with the profits. Option 2 is to build strong domestic institutions that, through legal mechanisms, prevent politicians from expropriating the investment. Obviously, this would be the preferred solution from the target state's perspective. The problem is that manufacturing credible commitments is the special sauce of democracy that is itself hard to develop. Well, as far as I can tell, the United States has made close to no tangible progress on either of those fronts. Yeah, Maduro is gone, but Maduro was not a source of military power. He was but a person. An American armada still sits off the Caribbean coast, but those ships cannot stay there literally forever. A true shift in the balance of power requires attriting Venezuelan metal. And yeah, some anti-aircraft systems met their end during the raid, but that is not going to result in long-term damage. As for improving institutions, Maduro's departure could have a substantial effect. However, for now, his deputy remains in charge. This is not regime change so much as a personnel swap. The Trump administration is hopeful that she will work with the United States under the literal threat of gunboat diplomacy. But Delcy Rodriguez is not suddenly constrained by any new institutional reforms. She is still the president of Venezuela, an illiberal democracy, just as Maduro was. And it might be tempting to look at Rodriguez's comments about signing contracts that forbid the expropriation of investments and start being optimistic. But like I said earlier, it is not the pledges right now that matter. It is what Rodriguez or any successor would want to do after the investment has been made. At that point, whatever she has pledged to is worth the paper that it is printed on. Whether she honestly plans to follow through or not, she has the incentive to say the same thing, because in both cases she would want US companies to front the investment. You can see this in ExxonMobil's reaction to the situation. Trump convened a meeting with US oil executives to discuss investment opportunities. The CEO of ExxonMobil noped the frack out of there, believing that it was another trap in the making. Now, I will say this. Just because the United States has not taken action to improve the situation does not mean that the United States will never. One thing I find absolutely nuts about the situation is what happened to Venezuela's stock market. Usually you are thinking war, instability, and therefore crashing prices. But nope. At the time of writing, the market is up 130%, consistent with the notion that Maduro was terrible for business, and whatever happens next cannot be as bad. Still, if the goal here is to secure oil, the easier conclusion to draw is that the administration is not doing a good job there. And that takes us to the final point of the day. Maybe Venezuela policy is not about oil, or not all about oil. I feel slightly silly for making this suggestion right after discussing a White House meeting with oil executives about Venezuela. But hear me out. The folks in the Trump administration seem relatively united on military action in Venezuela, though their motives are all over the place. Some worry about its connection to China and Russia, with Maduro's departure aimed at removing an opposing pawn from the board. Some worry about Maduro's human rights record and refusal to step down after losing an election, instead choosing to fabricate the vote tallies. Yet others very much do care about the oil. Of course, even the other two camps must think about the oil to some degree. It is impossible not to, given that Venezuela has the world's largest reserves. But a reasonable question to ask is whether oil is driving the current policy. And as far as we can tell, Marco Rubio is quarterbacking everything here. With Rubio squarely in the camp of supporting military action in Venezuela because Maduro refused to surrender power, it would not be surprising that Rubio is crafting policy based on maintaining domestic order in Venezuela, rather than resolving holdup problems with oil. He just does not find the business aspect of it to be super captivating. As it stands, the plan that Rubio has articulated is for Rodriguez to stay in control of the government for as long as it takes to oversee an orderly transition. using threats of further military action and withholding of oil revenue to force her to stay in line. If there is any argument for why oil is still the underlying concern here, it is that long-term investments in the country will only work if there is no civil war in the interim. Just look at Iraq if that requires further elaboration. Thus, making progress toward resolving the holdup problem must be secondary. Either way, the situation remains far from a resolution. Meanwhile, you can be resolved to learn more about the Venezuela crisis by checking out this playlist on the subject. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.